The intention of this video is to show how to run unit and integration tests. Unit tests are executed by default by the maven-surefire plugin, and integration tests are done by default with the maven-failsafe-plugin. Let us take a look on the project setup and configuration, how it looks like at the moment. So on the left side, you see the directory tree, source main Java plus package name plus class name. In this case, just a simple class first. And second area, source test Java plus package name plus first test, which is our current unit test. Furthermore, we have the view here on the pump file, where we define several parts like the dependency management. We are using the junit-jupiter BOM to include all the needed dependencies we would like to use. So we have the chance to simply define them without using the versions, as you can see here in the area with the dependencies here. We're only using the group and artifact ID and only define the scope here, nothing else. I've also defined an SRJ core dependency in the plugin dependency management. Next one is to see the SRJ core is used as a dependency in test scope. And of course, we have defined all the plugins we need to run this complete build, because we need to define all the versions of the different plugins here to be absolutely sure that every time we use that and change the Maven version or whatever we do here, that we are using the same versions of the same plugins here. I have decided to use the maven-surefire plugin and failsafe plugin with their appropriate version 3.0.m-M6. So let us take a look on the console, and there you see the tree of the project, and we can simply run the unit tests here, run ambient tests, and that runs the whole default lifecycle, which contains resources copying, compiling the production classes, as you can see here. Then using the test resources, which is used here, but because you're seeing here that the complete thing here is skipped because there does not exist a test sources directory. We also have a skipped here on the source main resources because we don't have any resources at the moment. Then, of course, we are using the compiler plugin, which is compiling the test classes here, as you can see by the goal here, test compile. And then you see target test classes, where the test classes are being compiled into. And of course, we are seeing the start of the maven-surefire plugin here, that we are running the appropriate unit tests. If we take a look on the execution of the first test here, the question comes up, how does maven-surefire knows what kind of classes use as test and how to execute them? Let us take a look into the documentation of the maven-surefire plugin here. I will search here for the maven-surefire plugin documentation. First one I use here to select that one. Go to goals and to tests. And there is a location which is called includes. And this defines which kind of namings will be used to identify unit tests here. If you follow that naming convention, every test will automatically identified by the maven-surefire plugin and will be executed here. And that is the most important thing. You should always follow the Maven conventions here. That means naming the unit test as like test star something, or maybe class name test or something like that. That means you will follow that naming convention all the time. So you don't need to configure something supplemental in the maven-surefire plugin configuration. And that is called convention over configuration. So if you would like to do it a complete different way, for example, naming your unit tests, for example, unit tests class name or something, then you have to change this configuration of the maven-surefire plugin, which you can do, but I usually don't recommend to do that, because the question is, where's the advantage and where is the disadvantage? So now going back to the IDE here, and now the question comes, why does the IDE know what kind of things are tests here? The simple thing is the IDE follows not the naming convention, it follows the annotations here. And that's a big difference here. And it identifies only based on the annotations here. And then there is no naming convention needed. That is sometimes causing a little bit confusion here, that the test from the IDE run, but not from the command line. And that exactly is the difference between using a convention for the unit tests and using only the annotations, for example, test and things like that. We will create a separate unit test or test class, which is not following the naming convention. I'm creating here a simple class, X, Y, Z, and then just generating a test method inside here. And you see already the IDE already identifies that class, or also the method here already as a unit test here, as you can see as the based on the green icons here. So run test, it is identified by the IDE. But if I run that on the command line, I will switch back now. So let us take a look and clean test and run that. As you can see, we are running here only 3 tests as in the example before. So has nothing been changed here, where we expected to run at least 4 tests because we have added a supplementary test. Of course, a complete useless test, but that's a different thing here. It should at least be executed, which is not the case here. And that's the difference between the IDE and the command line. So I just delete that class just to make it here more clear that there is a convention here. Next step is to create an integration test. What I will do is here for demonstration purposes, I will just simply copy that existing unit test and copy it as an integration test here. Let us take a look and just copy that. And now I use the naming conventions for the ITs, uppercase I, uppercase T, for integration test, which is the default of the Maven failsafe plugin. I can execute that in the IDE already. There is no problem here. That works out of the box without supplemental configuration. But the question is, how does it look like on the command line? And just trying to run the integration test. The integration tests are running during the lifecycle phase integration test, which is after the unit test phase and packaging phase and things like that. We will look up the Maven lifecycle here on the documentation here. Maven build lifecycle. And then we see the introduction into the build lifecycle here. And then we check on the documentation which kind of lifecycle phase are here related to. So what we can see here is that test compile, process, test classes, and test is the part which runs the unit tests. The test phase is the phase where the maven-surefire plugin is bound to by default. We can take a look up into the documentation of the Surefire plugin here. So you see in the Surefire test, there is one thing here, binds by default to the lifecycle phase test. And that is exactly how the unit tests are being executed by default. You don't need to say anything because it's given by default here in the lifecycle automatically by Maven, and that will automatically execute these tests here. So going back here to the documentation, you will see that there are other phases are following, like the prepare package, the pre-integration test, the integration test, and the post-integration test. The pre-integration and post-integration test phase could be used to set up some kind of special setup things like starting a server part or whatever you like. That depends on your needs here. And the post-integration test can be used, for example, to shut down a server or something if you're running some kind of integration tests here. So I usually use the Maven MVN verify to be sure that all these phases are running correctly in that order and I don't miss something. And now start MVN verify. So what you can see here is that, as expected first here, that the Surefire plugin is executed as before. We see that the jar plugin is executed. This is part of the packaging phase where the Maven jar plugin is bound to. But unfortunately, we don't see any execution of the integration test. So we called it first IT. So the problem is, why doesn't that happen here? So by default, the Maven failsafe plugin, which is responsible for executing the integration test, is not bound to the lifecycle by default. So we have to look up how to do that and then change our POM file and add the configuration for the Maven failsafe plugin here. This is the minimum you need to do to add the Maven failsafe plugin to the integration test phase. So the question is, how does the Maven failsafe plugin knows to which lifecycle phase it should be bound? Because we could add that here as well. but we don't need to. So the simple answer to that is because the Maven Failsafe plugin has also a default configuration as the maven-surefire plugin, which we can look up in the documentation here. So let us take a look for the Maven Failsafe plugin. Do the same thing here as before. So we have goals, integration tests, and the most important thing here is binds, that line here binds by default to lifecycle phase integration tests. And that is exactly the phase where the failsafe plugin is automatically bound to if we don't define the lifecycle phase explicitly in our POM file. So we will see what kind of implication that has now. So let's go back to the command line. So we restart that, the same example as before, but we already bound the integration test plugin to the lifecycle here. And now you see a big difference here. We have the Maven jar plugin as before, the package phase as named before, and now you see the Maven failsafe plugin execution here with the goal integration test. And that means this will be executed and automatically identifies the integration test based on the naming conventions here. First, IT. We should take a look another time into the documentation and see naming conventions coming from, and it exactly the same name as the Maven Surefire plugin. There is also a rule called includes, this one here. And then you see the differences here. The Maven failsafe plugin has the naming convention of IT, both uppercase, asterisk, that means IT anything. That means by using these different naming conventions, for example, something test.java, for example, means a unit test. Something it.java means an integration test. So that is a configuration and naming convention, which is very useful to follow. Based on the execution, we can now run the different parts like the unit tests or the integration tests. Let us try that. So I can just run mvn tests, and that will run only the unit tests. If I would like to run the unit test as well as the integration tests, I use verify instead. Cleaning up the screen here, and then you see the combination of both here. Running Surefire means unit tests, and running failsafe means integration test. But sometimes it happens that there are some issues with the unit test or with the integration test, and some other requirements that you would like to control the execution of the unit test and or the integration test. So let us take a more deeper look. So how could we control which parts are being executed and which one are not? So the first thing is we take a look what happens if a unit test fails. Okay, I will just change my code here. So if I run the test here, which will result in a complete failure here. That makes sense because if a unit test fails, it doesn't make sense to continue in any way. So there is no saying, okay, I should continue. Breaking a unit test means the whole build fails. As you see as a result here, the build is complete in state failure. You get the output here of the stack trace and things like that, and you see, of course, how many tests have been failed and things like that. And the more information, for example, based on my assertions here, I get the output which would like to show me the right path to the failing tests here. But we know this was intentionally done. So, okay, so far so good, no big deal. I'm going back and repair the tests here. So this one. So just going back and rerun the test just fine. So we see, as expected, the unit test doesn't fail anymore, and we got a green build means here the build is successful. But what about the integration test here? Okay, let us do the same thing with an integration test. I just use that IT and do the same thing here. So we change that and just run verify here to make sure that the integration test has been executed. What you see is a difference here. The first, maybe astonishing thing here is that you see as a result, the build is successful, which makes, depending on your point of view, no sense. As you see, what is interesting here, if I scroll up here, the unit tests have been executed successfully as expected because we didn't change the unit test code, but we changed the integration test code, as you can see here, first IT, as the same failure as before, but we executed that test and the test has been failed. But the result of the complete build is kept green or successful. So the question is why? The answer to the question is very simple in the end, because we didn't check the results of the integration tests. There is a difference between unit tests and integration tests. Unit tests are checked by default by the Surefire plugin. If one of the unit tests is failing, it will break the complete build. If one of the integration tests is failing, it will not break. That means Maven failsafe plugin does exactly that not. So you have to do a supplemental configuration to check that for all the integration tests. Sometimes people say it might be useful to allow integration tests fail. For example, if you think about some kind of environmental things like infrastructure, if that fails, it might be okay, but that depends on your point of view on your environment things and what you are doing in your integration test. It is possible to do so, as you can see here. What we need to do is now to add a check that every integration test will be checked and that if one integration test fails, the whole build will fail. Just going back into the IDE, into the POM file here, and adding a new goal, which is simply called verify. This supplemental call of the verify goal is just a goal of the Maven failsafe plugin. And then we take a look into the verify here. Verify integration tests run using Surefire. But we need to add this Maven failsafe verify here to check the results. Just showing the POM file here. I just simply add the goal verify here. Simply that. So I rerun the tests here. We know that the integration to one of the integration tests will fail. And what we should expect is that the build is not successful anymore. So I rerun that one here. What you can see here is, okay, the output for the error is the same as expected. But what it is different here now, we have a result of failure. That means this produces a failure because one of the integration tests has failed. Let's repair our integration test here first to get back to the normal configuration and normal execution here. Going back to our integration test, fixing that back. So now we rerun that whole stuff here to see if everything is working well. The result is now we are running our in-unit test as well we are running our integration test and the build is successful. But sometimes that is not sufficient because if you think of long-running integration tests, which are taking maybe minutes or even hours to run, it doesn't make sense to run them all the time. Or in special circumstances, for example, if you would like to create a release, it doesn't make sense to run all the tests either unit test and or integration test based on time or because you already have a CI running before which already checked that and you want to just create simply the release. So there are different options to do that and to accomplish that situation here. So we can suppress the running of unit tests by using a different or a particular property, which is called skip tests, for example. We can lifecycle phase test here, but add the supplemental system property here, skip tests. So let us take a look. What you can see is the lifecycle will run, but the interesting part is that Maven Surefire says here tests are skipped. That means also that none of the tests will be executed here. Yeah, that might be okay, but you would like to say, what about the integration test? So we can do that and say, okay, we can change the goal here, the lifecycle to verify and rerun that. Then you see a little problem here. We have running the lifecycle phase here. We see Surefire is executed, the jar plugin is executed, but the failsafe plugin is executed as well. But they both are prompting here, tests are skipped. The control here is not specific enough here. I would like to make sure that I can control either ignoring the unit test or ignoring the failsafe with the integration test, or both of them if I would like to. You can do that by adding a supplemental configuration to your POM file here. Now we would like to change the Surefire configuration. We will add a configuration here. We will show you name that with a supplemental name here. We're using skip ut, and we use the same configuration for the failsafe plugin, but we change the name for skip its instead. As you can see, the name here, skip tests, is existing in both plugins, in Surefire as well as in failsafe plugin. And that is a kind of the confusion here, because the name of that is exactly the same, and we are using the same property here on the command line. You can look up that into the documentation here, and then you see an entry here, property, skip tests. I'm at the moment here in the failsafe plugin here, which has the same name. And if I take a look into the Surefire, I have the same property here, skip test. That is exactly the problem here, that we have the same name for two plugins, which is a little bit confusing. So I have changed that, created two configuration, one skip UTs and skip ITs here. I can control exactly what I would like to ignore or skip simply. I just run the MVN verify, run the whole lifecycle, and give only the property skip UTs for skipping unit tests only. What you can see now here is that the Surefire plugin here is skipped, but the failsafe plugin is executing the tests here. So now I can change that and say ITs, for example, and I would like to skip only the integration tests, but the Surefire is executed and the unit tests are executed. That means I can skip only the integration test here separately. What I can do now is combine them and skip both if I would like to. Okay, that's kind of a duplication, which I can use the previous configuration for that, but that is much more clear what I would like to reach here. So that might be not enough for all the circumstances you have. Maybe that would mean that if I would like to ignore that, I need to add that configuration. That's not a big deal. That could be done as well. So what you can see is, if you take a closer look here, is that during the life cycle, if I do here a clean here, just a second, just make clean here to remove all the precompiled classes and things like that. Skip UTs, for example. If I run that, if you take a deeper look on the lifecycle here, then you see the Maven compiler plugin is running with the test compile, and it is saying here compiling two sources. That means in that case here that we are keeping compiling the unit tests here, as well as the integration tests, if there are some of them. There is a way to even prevent that if you like to do that, and say, okay, I do the same thing here, and I do use a different property here, maven test skip. That will change the thing here and not only skip the execution of the tests. We should look up that into the documentation here. Maven test skip. There's a property for that bypasses the unit test entirely, and it doesn't compile them. If I run clean verify, you see two things here. I have run clean. That means the target directory is completely cleaned up here and removed everything. And we are doing a compile, which is expected because the production code is compiled. That's fine. We have no resources, but it is a big difference to see here the test compile does not even compile the test sources. So we have not compiled the unit test code or the integration test code here. We can look up that into the target directory. Classes directory contains production code. If we take a look there, you see the first class, but we can do that also with other directories, but we won't see any directory which contains the test classes. Just do a clean verify here to run all the tests and compile everything. Then you can see that there is a directory created, which is called test classes, which will contain all the compiled test classes here. As you can see, the first IT, the integration test, as well as first test, which is the unit test here. And that's exactly the difference between using the test skip, Maven test skip, which skips the unit tests as well as the integration test, and even skips the compilation of them completely. It might be most of the time enough to just skip the execution of the test, but sometimes it's very helpful and convenient to even skip the compilation sometimes. So I reuse that to demonstrate that in another time here. As you can see, the compiler here is not running in the test compile phase here, not compiling test code sources. So that means Surefire, unit test, as well as failsafe, meaning integration tests, are completely skipped. What we can do also is, for example, to see, I would like to run only particular tests. I would like to execute only a single unit test or a bunch of unit tests. I don't want to run my 5,000 unit tests. I want to run only 300 of them or only within a particular package here. That's even possible with the command line as well, so it's more or less easy to do that. So I have created some supplemental test classes here, a second class, and first test I have added a supplemental unit test here. In the second test I have two test methods here, second, first, and so on, just to show the differences here. What I would like to do is on the command line that I can run only partially of the unit test, not all of them or just combine them. I would like to run only a few of them, that we get an impression. So we have running 8 tests in overall here. So what I can do now is to define which kind of test I would like to run. That can be done by the property test equals, and then the name. I can select either a test class, for example, first test. What you can see there is that I will run only the first test, as in the previous examples, and run only those four. So what I can do as well is to run only the second class here. I can select and make differences between the classes. So I can select the test is based on the classes, on the test classes to be more precisely. But what it is also possible to make a separation here on the methods within the classes. For example, to say, I would like to run the first test class, only the first test of it. So I have to look up the method name here. There is only a second at, for example. So I have to use the hash second at, and this can be used to select only a single test here. I can use a different one, and I use that one here. So I can select only this one, the first test of the first class, for example. What I can also do is to use and select only the parameterized test, first test hash, and run that only. That is possible too. So based on these parameters, you can select partially tests running of a whole class. I would like to run all the tests of a single class. I can run particular tests of a particular class. So I can also combine that and say, okay, I would like to run all the tests of the first test. And of course, I can separate them with a comma and run all the tests of the second class here. That would be the same equivalent if I don't define that, but I can do that and combine that in different ways. What you can also do is to do the same thing with the integration test. That is possible too. There is more or less no difference. The only thing you have to change here is to say it.test. So I can use first IT. I have to look up how the name exactly is named. I would like to use only first up from the integration test. I select the method with the hash sign here. So I can run only that one. As you can see, the first IT runs only a single one. I have not selected a particular unit test. That means we are running all the unit tests here. Based on our configuration, I could, of course, and say I would like to skip all the unit tests and only run particular integration tests. That might be sometimes very useful to run only a particular integration test, which takes very long, or because you want to test a particular change you have made in the code or something like that. So based on these parameters, you can do that in very, very convenient way in several ways. The documentation gives you more details. So you can use things like that here. You can also give a package name, for example, if you like to exactly separate and execute only tests from a particular package, for example, with some globs and things like that. That is possible. You can give also some special combinations with that. That means you have to be careful about quoting and the names you are using, because on different platforms, for example, on Windows, on Linux, on Mac, you have to be careful about what kind of characters you are using. So in general, I recommend just to quote that. That's the simplest solution and to prevent any problems here. What you can also do is not only selecting a particular test by using and giving the names here, it is also possible to use some regular expressions here if needed. And prefixing that percent, regex, square brackets, and then you can define all this stuff here around. So you can make very complicated setups and complex syntaxes, which you can do executing some particular tests if you would like to. So that's it for this video. Thank you for watching.